come at that age, but at what age does it come, and what should we look for if there's parents listening?
And I wouldn't necessarily say it's age, but it's really developmental, because everybody develops at a different rate.
Okay.
And so not all 5-year-olds are created the same, but it's around there in a thing. So, we all know the normals where it's the head standing, the head staying up, the crawling, the turning over, the walking, all those kind of ones are pretty normal. Verbal skills. So like if a kid has a hard time talking, that can create a lot of problems.
Tell me about it. That's what my 2-year-old's doing right now.
With exactly, and so like so normally around 2 is when they begin to talk, where they're able to form at least short sentences. I said no, those kind of things. That when they aren't able to formulate those kind of things, it can create problems and frustration, higher rates of anxiety. And so it's really important to get them into speech therapy. If you are like at least by 3, if they're really struggling to develop those skills. You see that commonly with children that have been in trauma or neglect situations.
Okay. So if, we'll presume that my kid Ethan has not been traumatized or neglected. Is it possible that some kids just refuse to talk because they have an older sibling doing the communicating for them? And then how long might that last? I'm making this personal, obviously, but I think it's generalizable to the audience. How long might that last before you get really concerned? 3?
Probably
4?
Around 3 or 4, when you get into that, going to preschool and elementary school, that's when it's really concerning, because
there's no sibling there to communicate
there's no
with.
sibling for them to communicate with. But it's like also like if if the other child wasn't there to talk for the kid, would your kid talk, kind of thing?
Yeah, so far we haven't seen that.
Yeah, right. But, where the close siblings like that will communicate with one another because they empathize. They understand more so what the 2-year-old's looking for than we do, because, we look at it through that adult lens.
So as we're raising kids and we get to, school age, and the reason I brought up the thing earlier about how important is consistency between and among environments is you may have family rules that the school won't necessarily enforce, or the after-school program, or the daycare. And I would reasonably assume that maybe if it's not something worth dying on the hill for at one of those areas, maybe it's not worth dying on the hill at the ex's house across town, for example.
Exactly.
So I guess, as we're getting these kids getting older, it's easier to maybe manage them a little bit better. What's an important thing for parents to know about school-age children, say, 5 to 10, with regard to how school treats them at home and enforcement of certain things across those environments?
Well, at school, they do more of the consequences type things. If you do this, this is what happens. So, yeah, they have somebody come in and teach feelings, but they don't have, they don't necessarily do that, incorporate it every single day or in every single classroom, unless it's maybe a social emotional learning school that focuses, because there's a lot of research that says the ability to handle feelings is really related to success in academics and social relationships.
It is. Yeah, and it has to do with impulsivity too. And if you have lower impulsivity, then you can concentrate better and get your work done.
Exactly. And so schools aren't going to empathize as much. Teachers aren't, they have 30 kids in the classroom.
Yeah, sure.
It's really hard to do that. And so part of that is being able to be that safe place for your kid when they get finished, when they're done at the end of the day at school. Because oftentimes what I'll hear is that kids will get into the car with their parents and say, Johnny hit me today. And then parents are like, well, you must have did something to provoke it. Or instead, just sitting there being able to talk about it and maybe figuring out alternative ways of handling it. To create that connection and to teach their kid, that's what, you were sad when Johnny hit you. And
this sounds like something that we deal with in group settings. So in group settings, and I'm pretty sure I covered this at some point in a podcast recently because it feels relevant or recent. In group settings, if somebody starts to get upset, the other group members will often reach out and try to pull that person out of their distress, not because they want them to feel good, which is okay, and that's part of it, but more so because we don't want to see them in that zone. And one of the ways we pull them out of that distress is we go to problem solving. We don't stay in limbic. We go to logic, and we start, throwing out suggestions like, get an attorney, or did you call the cops, or file a police report. And what you just described there with, it's always Johnny, right? It's Johnny or Timmy or Susie. So little Susie says, Timmy hit me, and the parent jumps right to problem solving, like, well, I got to attach a reason to it. You must have done something. Or what did the principal do? Or, did you get in trouble? Instead of just sitting there in the moment with them and validating, going, wow, how'd that make you feel? Or tell me about it. Describe what happened. And we sit there in their distress or their agony and help walk them through. So I think that's a good, important thing for parents to know, is not necessarily go jump into problem-solving mode when your kids are in distress, but be with them. And
it's not the problem is it's not really necessarily jumping into problem-solving mode is what they're doing. They're telling the kid how to solve the problem instead of also giving that responsibility, creating that independence, and teaching a kid how to problem solve on their own, creating that decision-making. Because we are often told what to do.
With no knowledge of it.
With no knowledge and no independence and no autonomy as to what we could choose to do to create that solution. So a common example in my office is when I have model magic, and it can be really hard to open for kids, and oftentimes they'll pull one time.
And then hand it to you.
And then hand it to me and say, open this. And I'll empathize, and I'm like, you're frustrated right now. You really want this open. And they're like, yeah, well, open it for me. And I'm like, well, I wonder if there's something you could do to open it. And then they'll kind of look at me, and maybe I'll make a gesture for scissors, kind of, giving them a little hint, or I'll kind of look in the area that the scissors are in, and then they'll go, oh, I can use scissors.
You're giving them options, which is really choices. So you're like, here's some options. I'll make the scissor motion, and the kid goes, oh, scissors. And then the kid feels like he or she solved the problem, not you, handing them the scissors.
Exactly.
You helped them there. That's cool.
Or sometimes kids will use their teeth.
Sure, that's creative.
Or they'll take it out of my hand and try pulling again, and then it will open, know. So, there's more solutions to a problem than what we think, and it gives them that this is the way that I set it. And so then it teaches them, well, if I can't get my car to start, when I'm 16, now what process do I run through to do it?
Right.
But I'm so used to having somebody tell me, go check the battery, or do this or do that. I don't know how to do that. I don't know how to walk myself through that process of creating a solution.
You're teaching them how to think, not what to think.
Yeah.
That's fundamental education is what it sounds like.
But I think the most important part is that feeling piece. It's really that feeling piece.
Knowing what the distress is inside oneself, labeling it accurately, tolerating it, and then returning to reason mode.
Yeah.
What? Tell us some developmental milestones we want to know between, say, 5 and 10 years old.
So 5, you'll see kids playing with each other more often. So you'll move from individual play. So if you and I were playing, I would be doing parallel play. So I would be playing something and you would be playing something, which is what you'll see in younger kids. But before age of 5, and then what you'll see in 5 and up is you'll see more cooperative type play. So we are playing something together. We are sharing things.
When do they stop snatching things out of each other's hands?
Oh.
Asking for a friend.
I think that's always a common question I have with parents, and
I stole your
I've
book
seen
the other
it
day.
probably
you didn't even realize it.
About 6 or 7, 8 sometimes. Honestly, I think, and that's that part of that emotional regulation, right? Because why do we snatch things out of someone's hands?
Impulse. We want it. It's exciting.
We want it. It's exciting.
Fun.
Or because you just snatched it out of my hands, now I'm angry. And so now I'm snatching it out of your hands. And so when we create that emotional regulation problem solving, we then begin to create that wiring in the brain to be able to stop that behavior sooner.
Yeah, it says I'm sad and I can tolerate it. I'm angry and I can tolerate it. It's not I'm angry and I'm going to bop you over the head.
Right.
Right.
So, Jake, you just stole a toy out of my hand. That makes me really sad. Can I have my toy back, please?
Mm-hmm. I think we skip over that as adults because we think it's so, elementary, and it is. And to slow down the adult brain and meet children where they are requires us to be vulnerable. It requires us to well, slow down, first of all, and our society is very, very fast-paced, and it just demands ever more. So there's a lot of hurdles to parenting that I think maybe we don't pay enough attention to. And things like that, we have to speak in kids' language. We have to remember that they're walking the earth for the first time. And we don't get to make assumptions about, you shouldn't have done that. It's like, well, how should they have known that? You have to teach them.
Right. I use the example as like when I go to my father's house, sometimes I get yelled at randomly. It's hilarious. I was in his cabinet one day and I ate something, and he came down the next day and he was like, "You shouldn't have eaten that. Like that was for me to make this today." And I was like, "Well, I didn't know. If you don't tell me, how am I supposed to know?" Like, and sometimes it takes a number of times, depending, especially with children with intellectual disabilities. It will take a number of times repeating the behavior over and over again, like telling them, that rule or that thing, and practicing it for them to really get it.
Well, I think I cut you off. You were going to say some more developmental milestones.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Some more about by the age of 10, we have a wider verbal range. So they're playing less, talking more while playing. So doing more social, learning more of those skills kind of thing. And then you get more of that in middle school, which is why middle school is so hard, because they're all practicing their social skills. And at that point, that's when all the limbic system is actually growing the most. And then later on in the teen years is when the prefrontal cortex is actually growing the most. So, you have like these two really big stages of development in early adolescence and then later adolescence, which is why, teens are so moody. They have a ton of hormones going through their bodies. And
the audience can't see me, but I'm really pensive because I used to be a middle school teacher. At one point, I was a long-term sub. I also had a wretched middle school experience. What I'm hearing is that the brain develops almost not simultaneously, but in waves. So it's like you go a lot of limbic when you're super young, then some logic, then some more limbic, then some more logic, then a whole bunch of limbic, and then a whole bunch more logic.
Yeah.
And if you don't learn how to regulate really both of those, because you could turn into just a verbioso. I'm just making up words now. Somebody who has a lot of language and suppresses emotion. Or you can just become a very emotional person. And it's important, I think, to balance both of those as you're developing. But it's interesting. I never considered the idea that the brain develops in parts like that. And I think that's really interesting. You're digging through your paperwork here. I wanted to go toward this idea of grandparenting, because we've kind of covered some parenting essentials and talking about kids and development, and I think that's really good.
And what I would say, if you want to learn more on the type of parenting that I talk about, the book I recommend is Emotion Coaching by John Gottman. When I started reading that, it changed my just whole perspective on how I handle kids. Just totally switched it. It's what I primarily use to teach parents, and so I really recommend that book.
Emotion Coaching or Emotional Coaching?
Emotion Coaching.
Emotion Coaching by John Gottman. That's Gottman. John and Julie Gottman are incredible therapists, people, researchers who have done a lot for the couples counseling world, but also family therapy as well.
So, this topic on grandparents raising grandchildren, it's really tough. It's becoming an increased problem in our society. I think that they say like 10% of children right now are being raised by their grandparents.
That sounds like a lot to my ears.
Yeah. I want to say that was the statistics that I saw yesterday when I was looking it up, or somewhere around there.
And I bet it's even higher. I'll bet that only captures official guardianships or something like that can be quantified. I'll bet it doesn't count the ones that are standing instead of informally.
Yeah, or the ones that live with parents
right.
too.
We got multi-generational families. Or in my parents' case, they see them 2 days a week.
Yeah,
they're absolutely grandparenting because they're with them all day, 2 days a week. So I don't want to overlook that either, where the grandparents are not necessarily full-time raising, but they're childcare, 40% of the time. That's significant.
That is significant. And I think the one that I focus on a lot is the that I'll be focusing on today is specifically the ones that are the primary caregivers. And I think because it's really tough, there's, kids are given to the grandparents for a number of reasons.